Thank you, John. And it's great to be here. It's always great to be able to get back to the home state, and it's especially great to be here with Tennessee Farm Bureau. I feel like a lot of this crowd must be Baptist because the front rows are a little empty. And last time I went to the Second Baptist Church, this is very similar to what it looked like. So I appreciate the Presbyterians and the Methodists for sitting a little closer this morning. We are going to talk about global food security's impact on national security today. The fun thing about Farm Bureau and Tennessee Farm Bureau and what you're very good at is being the voice of agriculture and really talking about what you do, amplifying that, and we get a lot of praise as farmers for feeding people. We talk a lot about hunger and growing crops. One thing that I don't think that we connect very often is how important you are and what you do to national security. So currently, we are in a global food security crisis, and we're going to talk a little bit about how global food security or insecurity impacts national security in a very real-time place that we're in right now. But before we do that, I want to give a little background again on who I am. I appreciate the introduction. But this whole journey started on a row crop, corn, soybean, cow-calf operation in Tennessee that I was raised on. It's a photo of my dad and I. He's here today. He doesn't usually get to hear me speak, but since this was close enough, he was able to come, so I appreciate that. And then all the lessons that you learn on the farm. And some people, when they say, well, I was raised on a farm, you wonder, well, were they raised on a farm and then left and didn't have anything to do with it? Were they very involved? And I would say I was somewhere in the middle. I got the fun job of picking up chunks in the fields. I can tell you I know exactly what it's like to be yelled through the radio. I know what it's like to be in 14th gear going across in a tractor pulling a grain wagon and hitting a hole and being jarred for the rest of the day. So there's a lot of aspects of the farm that I really appreciate growing up on and got to be involved in enough that it really generated my excitement for the future of agriculture and how we see that for the younger generation, and then also when we look at food security. After that, I was actually able to join the military right after high school. That is the first time that I'd ever traveled internationally. So I grew up in rural Northwest. We say Union City, but technically I'm from Crystal, Tennessee, and we did not travel very far outside of Crystal on family vacations. So when I joined the military, the first place I ever went was Germany, and then I went to Bulgaria and Romania. And a lot of people are like, well, why was the military there? And in hindsight of it being 6 or 7 years ago when I was there, we were actually flexing our muscles at Russia at that time. Unfortunately, it seems that we did not flex our muscles hard enough, long enough, and the war in Ukraine did happen. But being able to tie my interest for international development and the military to agriculture, I got very interested to see what agriculture is like in a developing world. So how can I take my experience of the farm, my experience through internships? I believe that Miss Babette is here. If you are Miss Babette McConnell, oh, Ty is waving his arms. So she was actually the first person to ever hire me. I started working at Pioneer at 14 years old during the summer. I did that for 5 summers, and then I went on to crop production services doing internships. So I got to learn a lot about agronomy, and I wanted to know how can I help people who may not understand agronomy like I do or don't have the equipment like we do in the U.S. to be better farmers, to be able to grow more food to feed themselves and their families. And that's what took me to a very rural village in Ghana. And when I say rural village, that is a mud hut. That is what everybody in the rural village lived in. And when we planted corn, you didn't have a tractor. There was no planter. It's out for your feet to dig a hole, and then you drop a seed and you cover the hole up with your foot. So we're talking centuries back. Agriculture for the U.S. is very current to what agriculture is in honestly, a lot of areas around the world. While I was there, the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee at the time, a man from Texas, came and he actually visited some of the projects that we were doing. And he appreciated it so much, he actually put a program in the 2018 Farm Bill to be able to continue doing projects like this. That's the first time that I'd ever really met with policymakers, and it's the first time that I'd ever really realized how important USDA, insurance, crop insurance, all of these programs that we have that are able to make farming what it is in the U.S., how important they are. Because when you go to Ghana, you don't have USDA. We didn't have crop insurance. We don't have all the Syngenas and the Bayer seed crop science. So it really made me view policy and politics, honestly, in a very different way to see how beneficial they can be to us with the right people in office, and then also the right advocates like Farm Bureau behind it to be able to push that. So that's what led me. I lobbied for a year for Syngenta. There's nothing that'll age you more than having to represent pesticides. It is a very difficult and controversial event that constantly goes on in DC. So I was offered an opportunity to come over to Farm Journal Foundation, and that's where I'll focus on global food security issues and get to talk about things that I'm going to talk about to you today with members of Congress. So you can see Senator Braun there and I having a conversation. So we're going to go over a few topics on exactly how food insecure countries are impacting and have the potential to significantly impact national security. One of those that we're all very familiar with, you've seen it on the news, is the increase in immigration. There's a lot of people who are migrating to the U.S. Another is there's been a significant growth in terrorism over the last couple of years and militias. That having to do some with food insecurity, also the fallout of Afghanistan or the pullout of Afghanistan has created some growth. We're going to talk about crime and drug trade. Believe it or not, this is something that we've been able to directly tie the increase in crime and drug trade to food insecurity, and then our economic trade interest. That's something that I know at Farm Bureau you talk a lot about is trade, and something I'll dive into a little different here later on, but trade really plays a lot into food insecure countries as well, and especially the importance of trade, not just for our markets, but for other countries. And then food aid. We have spent a lot of money, and I'll show you a graph later, on food aid over the last 3 years, and what is that doing to food insecure countries? So we're going to start out looking at the crisis. So we are in, according to the UN, a global food security crisis. There are significantly more people around the world who are hungry today than there ever have been. And if you look at this graph, you'll see that there's a plateau, 16, 17, 18, starts going up just a hair in 19, and then 2020. Well, we all know what happened beginning in 2020. There's a series of events, but you'll see a significant growth in 2020. This is actually a 2022 estimate. Just about 2 weeks ago, they came out with the latest on acute hunger for 2022, and it was actually 258 million. So they significantly underwrote how many people they thought would be hungry in 2022. And then for this year, we're expecting it to be over 300 million people. And that's not just hungry, we're talking about acute food insecurity. So when we look at hunger, there's actually 5 phases of hunger. Phase 1 being you may be hungry every now and then, as in you can't get food because you can't afford it or you don't have access every now and then. Phase 5 is famine. You are in actual starvation. There are a number of people within your country who are starving. So acute food insecurity is actually about a phase 4, between a phase 3 and phase 4, and that is where you're going to bed hungry at night, and there's a lack of access to food, and you can barely afford the food. So we're not talking about, there's some people who couldn't get food every now and then. This is a genuine hunger phase. And if you look at the projection for this year of being over 300 million, the U.S. population is about 333 million right now. So you're looking at the entire population of the U.S. If you take that population and spread it out globally, that's how many people are facing acute food insecurity. And I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. We call it the 3C trifecta. Conflict, obviously the war in Ukraine has caused a lot of disruption. Not only the war in Ukraine, but if you've seen on the news, Sudan, South Sudan is having a lot of conflict in that area. If you look at just south of Mexico, there's several countries who have been having conflict. So all of that conflict goes in turn and creates food insecurity, but also food insecurity can create conflict. If you look at COVID, you all experienced a lot of the supply chain mishaps that it gets called. However, there's a lot of disruption in the supply chain, a lot of disruption in input costs. I'm sure many of you here are not happy with how much you have been spending on fuel. It's very expensive right now to be able to put fuel in your tractor. Fertilizer, we've all talked about And Farm Bureau has been a great advocate in DC on the fertilizer crisis. And then I like to relate this back to the smallholder farmer in Ghana. There's actually significantly more smallholder farmers around the world than there are larger US farms. And when you look at those guys, if it's difficult for you to get fuel, and it's difficult for you to get fertilizer, or it's expensive, you can multiply that by about 100 for a smallholder farmer. Maybe they just started being able to use fertilizer 10, maybe even just 5 years ago. And now if they're able to find it, it's way too expensive for them to be able to afford. We all know how important fertilizer is for our crops. If you can take a yield for 200 bushels an acre of corn up to 250, you're going to put that input in because you know that you're going to get the benefit in our market. If you're looking at a small farmer in Ghana who might have 2 acres, and that's pretty big. If you're a smallholder farmer, 2 acres is a lot. And you were to take away fertilizer completely, you're looking at yields where they maybe we're going to get 50 bushels an acre, and now maybe they're going to get 10. So it impacts them a lot more significantly, a lot more quicker. If you view it from the government standpoint and just how many programs that we have, the risk reward is a lot different. We farm to be able to profit, to be able to feed people, to be able to sell, to make ethanol, plastics, all of these different things. Most of your smallholder farmers are farming to be able to feed their families. And then hopefully they're able to sell to a market to have enough food to be able to grow their own economy, be able to afford to take their kids to school. So the risk reward is a little different for us versus a smallholder farmer in places like Ghana or across the continent of Africa, South Asia. Another is climate. And I'm not here to debate climate, but I think we can all agree as farmers that we've seen different weather patterns, especially over the last few years. My hometown in Obion County is a great example. Earlier this year, at least on our farm, Obion County is one of those fun places that half of the county might get a lot of rain, and then it's always your farm that never gets enough. So we went through about a month where we really didn't see any rain. And then just last week, Union City got hit with about 14 inches of rain in 24 hours. So that was the first time that my dad had said he'd ever seen Earlfoot Avenue underwater. A lot of soybeans are underwater in that area. There's even a lot of corn where the water was up to the ears. So we're going to see that play a different effect. And if you look at just how weather has changed and how it impacts farmers, again, we have crop insurance. Or a lot of our crops are genetically modified or using really good seed varieties. The fact that we went nearly a month without rain and our corn still looked as good as it did, we can thank bear crop scientists and the Syngenas and the Cortevas of the world for doing that research to be able to have drought tolerance. There is no drought-tolerant seed for most smallholder farmers. So when they get hit with a month of no rain, you're looking at corn that might come up to the calf and no hope. So it again impacts them a lot different. If you look at this map, this is the countries who are being impacted the most currently by inefficient food. And you can kind of see a band there. A lot of that band of the worst area is around the equator. So a lot of areas that get very hot and they don't have drought-tolerant seed, so they're not able to produce as much. When you combine all three of these, we end up with a situation where we have nearly 300 million people who are acutely food insecure. Getting back to migration, just within a year, and I've looked for the 2023 numbers, and I'm sure none of you will be surprised that it's hard to find how many people are crossing the border right now. So from 2021 to 2022, there was over 1 million people who crossed the border just from Mexico. A lot of people will view that as there's a lot of people coming from Mexico. However, most migration actually happens as they pass through Mexico. So if you look at the countries just below Mexico, you're going to see a lot of countries who up to 70 to 80% of the country is reliant on agriculture, meaning that their workforce is reliant on agriculture. A lot of the food comes directly from in-country, not all, but some of the food, quite a bit of the food comes directly from in-country. So they take shocks a lot differently. this photo is actually a good representation of that, and a good representation of how much the U.S. has invested in agricultural research and development versus some other countries, and developing countries especially. So these are coffee trees. On the right, you'll see healthy coffee trees. On the left, you'll see coffee trees that are not so healthy. Coffee plants take between 3 to 5 years to be able to grow and produce. I'm sure that you all maybe you've bought coffee out in the lobby, or have bought coffee anytime within the past couple of years. It's a lot more expensive now. A lot of the cost of coffee rising has been due to areas like this where they have been hit with a coffee rust. In the US, if your soybeans get rust on them, what do? You've got a fungicide. You can spray it. You expect soybeans to be able to come out of that. You expect your yield to still be good. We've done a lot of research and development on this. We have a number of products. If you're looking at Honduras and your coffee gets rust on it, they really don't have the products to be able to just spray and get those coffee plants to come out of it. It's something as simple as that a lot of times we take for granted, but it's something that could have kept this entire operation going. When you have an operation like this that loses production, again, this isn't annual. We grow corn and soybeans annually, cotton annually, beef throughout the year. However, this takes 3 to 5 years, so they're out. The business owner is out. The work labor is out of a job. If you look at the transportation, the shipments, the cargo, there's less of it, so it has a very significant impact. And when people aren't able to afford food or aren't growing enough food, they want to go somewhere that does have a lot of food. And in the U.S., we have plenty of food. So that's one of the big reasons for the migration that we don't talk about. It's not just the land of opportunity, it's that there's a lot of people in the world right now who are hungry and they're desperate and they're going to go somewhere where they can have food to be able to continue living. So again, shocks have been bigger. There's a lot of countries, again, that are very reliant on agriculture. Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, are very reliant on agriculture. 75% of the livelihoods work within agriculture. When we pulled out of Afghanistan, we actually had a lot of agriculture programs that we were doing in Afghanistan and Iraq. A number of universities were working there. We were trying to help them actually take poppy production out, poppy making drugs, and we were trying to get them to start growing different commodities so that they would be able to, A, not have to import so many commodities via their government, and B, be able to stabilize the country with some food insecurity and not be growing as many drugs. And when we pulled out, all of those programs essentially shut off. It's a lot easier to grow militias and terrorist organizations when people are hungry. So the way a lot of that works is quite literal. People are hungry and they're desperate, and terrorists know how to control people via hunger. We're seeing this right now in Ukraine. When I studied this, I have a master's degree from Texas A&M. Ms. Rodana pointed out that I didn't have my Aggie ring on earlier, so apologies if there are any other Aggies in here, but I'm also a Mississippi State grad, so go Bulldogs. But when I was studying this at Texas A&M, we were studying how people use hunger to grow terrorist organizations, and never at that time did we even consider in the Western world this would happen. So it's been very interesting to see Ukraine, and that's exactly what Russia is doing. Russia is not, people say on the news, well, they're attacking Ukraine's infrastructure. They're attacking Ukraine's agriculture infrastructure. So you'll see a lot about the grain exports, the deal that unfortunately just went out. So it has everything to do with exports. They are attacking railways, so to be able to get the grain from the farm to the port. They're attacking water systems. And they're quite literally using and weaponizing agriculture and food to be able to control and minimize their military support. And this is something that we also see in the Middle East and the Horn of Africa. People ask, well, Ukraine is so far, does it really matter what Ukraine is doing to the U.S. and to our own national security? And if you look at it through the agriculture lens, no, we don't import a lot of grain from Ukraine. However, the Horn of Africa and Northern Africa and the Middle East do. So about 80% of the exports out of Ukraine that are grain go to Middle East and the Horn of Africa. Well, guess where a lot of the people who don't really like the U.S. are? A lot of terrorist organizations who aren't quite fond of the U.S. and all of our freedom are in the Middle East and are in the Horn of Africa. So this really amplifies their ability to grow those organizations, which isn't great for our national security interests. We're able to directly tie drug production and crime to food insecurity as well. So Farm Journal Foundation just released a report back in March over all the different ways, but I think the most interesting to me and something that I didn't think about was the amount of drug production and crime that has increased. One of the big reasons, again, is people get desperate. If you're very hungry and if you have kids who are very hungry and a cartel comes to you and says, hey, if you just run this route twice a day, we'll be able to make sure you have enough money to feed your family. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and it's really amplified the amount of drug trade that's happened and the amount of crime that's happened, but also the amount of production that's happened. So in South America, coca, which also is the main ingredient for a drug, can be harvested 4 to 6 times a year after an 18-month growing period. So it grows fast. And the more they put it in production, significantly amplifies the amount of coca that can be grown. Again, if you look at Afghanistan, the same thing is happening. We're not just seeing more people use it and more trade happening, we're actually seeing an increase in production, which is a national security risk. So economic interest. I get asked a lot, well, Kelsey, if we're investing in other countries, I don't know how I really feel about my tax dollars going to different countries, and we have a lot of needs in the U.S. Completely agree. We have a lot of needs in the U.S. that need to be under control. However, we really get a big return on these investments. Sometimes it's difficult to see, but for national security risk alone, being able to invest agriculture and research, any kind of development efforts in these countries to build them up to be more sustainable is in our best national security interest. But it's also in our best agriculture interest. All 3 of these countries are great examples. I could name a lot more, but we didn't just start trading with Guatemala one day. We didn't call them up and say, hey, we've got some really tasty things that we think you would like, or hey, we've got some feed that we think your cows would really like. And they said, you know what, we're going to start buying it. What we did is we literally, through USDA programs, USAID programs, started doing development within agriculture in those countries so that we can build those smallholder farmers up enough and build their economy up enough that they're able to afford to import our own products. So Guatemala, Vietnam, again, Vietnam is a really great example in Nigeria. I also use the example of Japan. We know in the last administration, it was a really big deal whenever we were able to start exporting beef to Japan. We didn't call up Japan one day and say, hey, this stuff's tasty. We know that Wagyu stuff you have is good, but you should try some of our beef as well. We really started doing a lot of development within Japan. I'm sure some of you have went overseas with different organizations before, and a lot of it is you're making friends. You're making friends. You'll talk about your products. We have really good cheeses. We have really good milk, dairy products. Mexico is another great example. Mexico is our largest importer of most agriculture products. And we started doing research, science, technology there. We were able to help build up their economy. They thought apparently that our milk and our cheeses and our beefs are pretty good, so they started buying it. So whenever we invest long term, we know we get a return. And we'll talk a little bit about those. So every dollar that the United States government invests in domestic agriculture research and development, you get $20 on return. I don't know about you, but if I had a few $1,000s laying around and somebody told me that I was going to get $20 to every dollar, it would be an easy yes. Every dollar that the U.S. government invests in international agriculture research and development, we're getting a $10 return. Still a really good return. However, when we do food aid, we are helping people. It is a great humanitarian cause, but there is no return significantly dollar-wise on our investment when we're doing food aid. Again, I'm not against emergency food aid. There are hungry people. Another reason that I love Farm Bureau is we're not just about farming and family, we're also about faith. And that's one of the 3 reasons that I got into agriculture development. I loved the international world. I loved agriculture, but also I thought it was the right thing to do. I like to serve. I think that we are a bountiful country. We are very fortunate and drew the lucky lottery whenever God gave birth to us in the United States. However, I think that there's a lot of people who, despite any decisions that maybe their own government has made, are hungry and are good people, and if they're in an emergency situation, we should help them. But if you'll look at how much our emergency food assistance has increased, that's what that blue line is. So that is food aid that we have, our food aid budget that has increased over the last 2-3 years. So last year we spent upward of about $14 billion in food aid. But if you look at that orange line, that is our line of how much we've been spending in long-term agriculture investments internationally. So if you take this back even farther, it'll actually show that the more we increase our investments in international agriculture research internationally, then the lower our food aid has been. And we've really dropped off from that investment. So much so that domestically as well, in the last 2 decades, the public investment for domestic agriculture research and development has actually declined by 1/3. Unfortunately. And I also hear people say, well, Syngenta and Bayer and all these companies, Kelsey, they're doing so much more research and development. The University of Tennessee, these universities, everybody is doing more research. However, a lot of the universities rely on public investments in agriculture. They're also doing research on corn, cotton, soybeans, the things that a lot of people here grow. They do quite a bit of animal investments as well when you look at vaccines and different developments. But the last time I checked, at least for breakfast, there was no cotton or number 2 dent corn or a soybean sitting on my plate. We need all of those things for fiber, for end product of food, where a lot of that goes to grain and is able to feed cattle. However, most research and development, public research and development, really needs to go to our actual food products. So the things that you're putting on your plate, really, Bayer and Syngenta aren't getting a large number on their investment or return on investment from that. So that's not the research they're doing, which really means that we need to up our investments in the things that we are eating, the things that we are consuming, so that we can stabilize our food system. If there's one thing I think we can all agree on that COVID taught us, is we recognize that our food system is way more vulnerable than we thought. It was hard there for a while to sometimes even find milk in the grocery store. Eggs have skyrocketed. We've seen our own food get incredibly expensive. I have a 4-year-old, and somehow my budget with a 4-year-old is a lot more expensive than when he was 2. These kids eat a lot of food, and they eat a lot of fruit. People have been complaining about egg prices. Have any of you bought fruit for a toddler lately? It's expensive. So when we look at these as a whole, it seems like the trend is going up. I know that USDA just released a report a couple of days ago where the trend line for global food costs went up again. It planed off the month before last, and then now it's back up a little bit. And it doesn't seem like anytime soon it's going to go down. So again, it's harder to sell, though, to Congress a long-term investment, right? And it's difficult sometimes to sell to people. If you don't see that immediate gratification, it's a little different to know if you're making a good investment. Thankfully, through history and USDA's good statistics, we know that it is a good investment, and it's something that needs to be talked about more. I gave a speech similar to this at a Farm Bureau conference for Tennessee back in December, and at the time I really harped on how much ag research needs to be talked about. It's not talked about enough in DC, and I've been pleasantly surprised over the last 6 months just how much members of Congress have grasped onto this idea. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa has actually made ag research his #1 priority for the Farm Bill. We've seen several other members of Congress who have grasped onto it. Though I think we're going in the right direction after all we've seen in the last few years, but it's not always something that's on the top of everybody's agenda. However, I think because it hasn't been on the top of people's agenda, we're starting to see the repercussions of that and how it impacts not just what we grow and how we grow it, but the food that's on our plate, how many people we're able to feed, the national security risk that we're taking on. Again, talking about the long-term investment and how it's declined, So we're getting significantly outpaced when it comes to investments, long-term investments in agriculture research and development by other countries, especially our trade competitors. The very people that we would like to not outproduce us are investing more in agriculture research and development than we are. The number one country being China. China is significantly outpacing us in our investments in research and development. So you'll see this blue line, that is China. You'll also see that it stops in 2015. You probably won't be surprised that that blue line stops in 2015 because China decided that they were no longer going to share with us how many dollars that they were actually investing in research and development. This is a national security risk as well to me. You all have heard a lot about China. I know that there's probably a lot of people in here who are worried about how much control China has gained and how much the markets have changed or probably should change more because of them and the risk that they provide. So it's a little worrisome that our investments are getting outpaced that much, especially by a country like China. Lastly, I say use your voice. I don't have to say that because Tennessee Farm Bureau does a great job of that. But one of the other big things that I don't feel like I talked enough about is trade. Right now, trade is not being talked about enough as well. I'll add in that tidbit along with ag research. We all know how important it is, important for our products, whether it be beef, corn, soy, your fruit products, everything. And it's kind of fallen off the wagon of not being a priority lately. The way I view it, with the amount of food insecurity that we have going on, with the amount of lack of grain from Ukraine, these are unfortunate times, but opportunities that the U.S. really needs to be taken advantage of. We've seen how much Ukraine has actually impacted markets here in the U.S., but if you look at Tennessee alone, there's a lot more farmers who are growing wheat right now than have been in the last several years because of the market. So the more you can use your voice to talk about these trade deals that need to be had, the long-term investment in agricultural research that we can have, the better the outcome is going to be. Unfortunately, we live in a time where there's a lot of issues. I'm sure there's a lot of issues that I haven't scathed that you all have been talking about that pertain to you personally. But when we look at, take our personal farm out of the purview, look at our kids, look at the future of what are we going to leave them, what kind of food system are we going to leave them, how vulnerable are we going to make the rest of the world be. I think it's really important to have personal issues that you get to talk to with your members of Congress, but also have these broader issues of, hey, we all need to band together and talk about the long-term investments that we're making so we don't get into another food security crisis, so we don't make our country more vulnerable, and so that the U.S. is able to continue producing what they do and be able to feed the amount of people that they do. So with that, it's great, again, to be in Tennessee. I'm happy to be around farmers always, and we're going to take a couple of questions.
Thank you, Kelsey. I would like to remind you that if you do have some questions, you can text those to 931-212-8799. First question is a great presentation. What are your thoughts on the effectiveness of U.S. food aid through monetary assistance versus supplying actual U.S. commodities?
So I'm assuming you're saying dollars versus actual grain. I don't know who asked this, so I'm going to take that as the question. I actually believe that there is use for both, and here's why. I think that the use for grain and us sending grain to different countries is great. However, you have to think too, if we're sending wheat to, let's say, a rural village in Ghana, because that's where I'm familiar with, and you send them a whole big bag of wheat. A lot of people in Ghana don't really know what to do with that. They don't eat a lot of wheat because they don't have a lot of wheat. And somebody the other day was like, well, they can make bread. I'm like, well, believe it or not, there's not very many ovens in the mud huts in Bulhagu, Ghana. So sometimes you run into that issue, not always. Sometimes you run into issues like that. And when I say not always, it can be great if we're sending other commodities over there that they do eat. A lot of Ghanaians eat corn. They actually mash it up. They turn it into a blob that they call TZ. I did not think it was very appetizing. It's fermented. However, they very much enjoy it. So in emergency situations, I think that anything at times can be better than nothing. But if it's a non-emergency situation, a lot of times, even sometimes an emergency situation, giving people that are very desperate and hungry money is good because they are able to buy grains from local farmers, and it is able to stabilize their local area. And that's why we do most of the monetary funding, is so that they're able to, because not everybody is in starvation. Sometimes it can be like Obion County, where half of the village gets rain and the other half doesn't get rain. So you'll have some farms who are able to produce. If the other side of the village wasn't able to produce and they don't have any money, giving them money to be able to buy grain from that other farmer on the other side of the village is able to allow him to sell it. Whereas if you're just giving him grain, if you're giving the hungry guy grain, then it really kicks the guy who actually was able to grow a crop in the teeth a little bit, because then he doesn't have anybody to sell it to because the Americans came in and saved the hungry. So there's times when monetary donations are good because it allows them to be able to stabilize their own economy. It allows them to have more money flow. However, there's risk and rewards with both. So it's neither is always best. It really depends on the situation.
Perfect.
Accountability is key also.
Second question is, why are these countries not allowing the newer seeds and traits such as drought tolerance?
China. Another thing that bulls me a little bit is when the United States quit taking their investment in international development so seriously, China saw a grave opportunity too. So China really went into, they're in pretty much every developing country. And the difference between China going into a developing country and the US going into it, China and Europe, I should say, going into a developing country is typically we have the best interest at heart. China will build something large and it's most likely going to crumble in 5 to 10 years, and they'll say, we'll build this, but you need to understand, quite literally, that GMOs are bad for you, that they can cause all these diseases, that you shouldn't take them on. They'll spread a lot of propaganda. And so in Ghana, GMO seeds were not allowed, and a lot of that had to do with Europeans and the Chinese influence that GMOs were bad. However, there are a couple of countries in this last year, Morocco being one of them, that have finally started turning around.
Okay. And our last question, can you speak a little bit on the Howard Buffett Foundation and the Farm Journal coverage of the hunger in Ukraine?
Yeah, sure. A little bit. So Farm Journal Foundation is separate from Farm Journal Media. They did start us, but now all of our funding actually comes from a variety of entities. So I can talk a little bit about Farm Journal. I can talk a lot about the Howard G. Buffett Foundation. My professor and the guy who actually wrote our big report that came out in March, he's the chairman of the Howard G. Buffett Foundation. If you're not familiar with the Howard Buffett Foundation, Howard Buffett, the son of Warren Buffett, has a large foundation that focuses on global food security. I'm a big fan of Howard Buffett's foundation because he doesn't look at it as we need to come in and essentially give people food. He's very big on being able to use those countries to create traits, even if they're not genetically modified. He invests a lot there. He invests a lot in dams to be able to help retain water in rural sub-Saharan areas. So he does a lot of good work. His main focus right now, according to his chairman, is Ukraine. So the Howard G. Buffett Foundation has gone into Ukraine several different times. Last year, they did about $50 million in investment in Ukraine. This year, he's projected to do over $200 million. And what he's doing is going in and looking at the storage and how do we help Ukraine with storage. How do we help Ukraine with being able to build back a lot of the railways? And if we can't build back the railways, how do we help Ukrainian farmers find alternate routes to be able to export their grain? So it's a lot of foundations like the Howard G. Buffett Foundation who have gotten together. Kip Tom, he's a former ambassador to the Food and Ag Organization in Rome under the Trump administration. He's part of a lot of those efforts. I'm very blessed to be able to talk to folks who are constantly over there and doing work, but I don't know if that was specifically answered the question, but I will say that Ukraine is difficult. We've spent a lot of money in Ukraine. I'm not saying whether I necessarily think it's a good thing or a bad thing, but Ukraine is going to be changed for a very long time. So Ukraine is not a situation where we're going to be able to go in and find a place for them to export and all is going to be fixed. There's been a lot of landmines that have been placed in various areas, farm areas of Ukraine, and have destroyed a lot of operations. Also, if you think about, it's been difficult to get parts in the US. If you're in a war-torn country, it is very difficult to find parts. So when you break down, you're not coming back online for a while. There's a number of different things that the farmers there are facing that are going to set them back for, in my opinion, decades to come. So I think that it's important what Howard G. Buffett is doing and these foundations are doing to try to be able to help them. However, I think we also federally have to look at the obvious that agriculture is going to be changed, trade is going to be changed, and how do we play a part in shaping how trade is changed in our best interest? Because if we don't, let's be honest, Brazil just became the #1 export. Brazil is now exporting more corn than we are. Brazil grows less than a third of the amount of corn that we do. However, they're now exporting more than we do. So if we're not taking advantage of situations like that within trade, then we're going to continue complaining about market prices.